Our guest today is Caleb Maupin, a widely acclaimed speaker, writer, journalist, and political analyst. He has traveled extensively in the Middle East and in Latin America. He was involved with the Occupy Wall Street movement from its early planning stages and has been involved in many struggles for social justice. Today, he joins us to share his viewpoints on capitalism versus communism. Find out more about Caleb and his writings at calebmaupin.com. Hi, Caleb. Welcome to Savvy Business Radio for our Heartbeat of the World segment. I'm so grateful to have you out here today. And you are a journalist. You work for RT. You've also worked for a number of alternative news networks and such. You travel the world. And I love that we're going to have you out here today to share your unique perspective on socialism and capitalism. We have had people talk about it in the past, but you've traveled the world. And being an investigative reporter, you have a deep understanding that a lot of people might not have. Before we go to that, just share a little bit about your background. What brought you into journalism?
Oh, well, I was an Occupy Wall Street activist during the Occupy Wall Street protests. I'm actually from Ohio originally. There's been a lot of different things that have inspired me to really try to find out about the world and why things are the way they are and try to change it. I think that there's no contradiction between understanding the world and trying to change it at the same time. And that in order to do one effectively, you have to do the other. That's kind of how it works.
Yeah, absolutely. And from traveling abroad and also living here in the United States, what have you seen as some of the biggest misconceptions about socialism and communism?
I think we need to first get our definitions straight. Now, when we talk about capitalism, a lot of people think about their friend Joe, the bar owner, who works very hard and works for hours, scrubbing floors and building up his community business. Well, we need to be clear when we talk about capitalists and the capitalist ruling class. We're not talking about, mom and pop store owners. We're not talking about people tinkering around in their garage and developing a new idea. The people who rule the world in the 21st century are billionaire monopolists, people with more wealth and power. You would actually talk to one of these people, they probably couldn't even tell you how much money they actually have. When one of the Rockefellers was being appointed to a government position in the 1970s, investigative journalists couldn't even figure out how much money he actually had. Think about the bankers at the center of the IMF and the World Bank or the European Union. You think about people with so much money, the Rockefellers, the DuPonts, the Carnegies, international, global financial elites. That's the capitalism that we face in the 21st century. And capitalism is a system where the major centers of economic power, the banks, the big box stores, the factories, the oil wells, that they're all the private property of owners. They own it. And because they own it, it becomes operated for the purpose of making profits for them. And that's what capitalism is, right? Under capitalism, the majority of the human race, they sell their labor in order to survive. They work. But there's a small group of people who own the major industries and own the centers of economic power, and they own for a living, and the rest of us work. And that's capitalism. Socialism is an alternative economic system in which the banks and the factories and the major centers of economic power are under public control, and they're public property. And instead of operating to make profits for a group of owners, they operate according to a central plan, and that the state, sits down and dictates how much steel is going to be produced, how many loans are going to be handed out for the overall good of the country and for the population. It's a centrally planned economy. Some people call it economic democracy because instead of capitalists and private billionaires owning the economy, a government that represents the people actually has the ability to dictate economic policy and determine what kind of production goes on. So that's our definitions. Let's get our definitions straight. There's a lot of confusion. I've heard people say that the USA is half socialist and half capitalist. That's completely false. We have a very, very capitalist economy. I've heard people say that socialism is when the government gives people free stuff. And any capitalist economy is going to have some welfare state. Most countries in the world, especially most Western countries, do have national health care. That's not socialism. That's just a welfare state initiative that's given to people. So we need to get our definitions straight. Socialism is a centrally planned economy. Capitalism is an economy based on profits.
Now, I'm wondering, though, because I had heard that we're supposed to have laws in place that really prohibit monopolies and such. How do we get, because I know when the country got started, yes, we had the steel industry and we had the Rockefellers, but there was more of a chance for small business to thrive. Why has it changed so much? And is it a way to get it back where kind of small businesses can thrive even in a capitalistic society, or not really?
Well, that's very interesting, and that is what you talk to a lot of folks. They do have this illusion that we could go back to the good capitalism. They talk about like the Gilded Age and the days of the industry and the titans of industry, and that's kind of an illusion. I mean, history marches forward. I think if you look at all through human history, the majority of human history, we were hunter gatherers in the woods. We lived in tribes of 30 or 40 people, but then eventually it became necessary to have agriculture, and that gave birth to the feudalism and the Roman Empire and Egypt and some of these ancient civilizations, eventually medieval times, and capitalism emerged as an advance over feudalism, and that eventually from capitalism we will eventually get a higher stage of production, of organized production, of socialism, and that trying to restore the past and trying to go back to the way things were before, it's kind of an illusion. And what is also interesting is if you look at the socialism that exists today, like in China, in Vietnam, and Cuba, one of the main ways that they're building up their socialist system is by strengthening small businesses. If you look at that, while the major industries are in the hands of the state, banking and such, they're building up small businesses, and they see that as a way to kind of strengthen the overall socialist vision. Let people go own bars and restaurants, hotels. These kind of things shouldn't be run by the state. And often you'll see that the socialist governments in these countries are actually strengthening small businesses because they see that they're necessary in order to build a vital economy. And that the Soviet model, the way of doing things where everything was just completely government owned, that didn't really work out too well, and that there were a lot of people who, they didn't want to be part of this state central plan. They had their own ideas. They felt crushed. And that was what contributed in a lot of ways to the collapse of the Soviet Union. But if you look at it, the question is, do we want an economy that's completely the anarchy, right? Just capitalists trying to make lots and lots of money for themselves, or do we want to have a rationally planned economy in which we sit down and say, what's for the best of the country? That's the difference between capitalism and socialism.
And it's interesting because I've heard people mention that and say, now capitalism is socialism is not the same as communism. One is a social construction and one is a governmental construction. Share that for me, because I know they're not the same thing.
Well, according to the Marxist theory, and this is where it gets a little, you're almost talking semantics here, but according to the Marxist theory, Karl Marx laid out, his theory was that first, after capitalism, the working class would rise up and take control of the industries. And then they would create a socialist planned economy with the means of production in the hands of the working class. And that eventually, over the course of thousands of years, that would eventually give birth to a higher stage of communism, right? And that there would be so much material abundance that the need for any state coercion and government coercion would be eliminated. That's the Marxist theory. And that this gets confusing because there are a lot of governments around the world that people refer to as communist governments. They'll talk about communist China or the communist Soviet Union. Well, they're led by communist parties, but they referred to their economies as socialist economies. They would just like to strive eventually to have communism as the ultimate goal of a classless, stateless world. It gets a little confusing. And then you have a lot of the capitalist countries like Norway and Sweden will have socialist parties in government that enact bigger welfare states and would like to eventually, possibly on paper, move their country closer to socialism, but they haven't ever gotten there. And so it confuses people, and people say, well, those communists are in China, socialists are in Norway. It gets very, very confusing. And when it gets down to it, it's a semantical argument. But it is important to distinguish the two. I've had people say, well, why does China have a state if it's a communist country? Well, it's not a communist country. It's a socialist economy that is moving, in theory, eventually moving toward communism. It's a point of semantics, but that is a point of disagreement. People are, everything we hear is very confusing. One of the most common misconceptions we hear is I've heard people say socialism failed everywhere it's ever been tried. I'm sure you've heard that before. Yeah. Communism and socialism, they only work on paper. Well, let's back up for a moment, right? 1917, Russia was an agrarian economy. No steel industry to speak of, no electricity. In the 1930s, with the 5-year plans, they rapidly industrialized. They became the world's leading steel-producing country. They eventually defeated the Nazis. They were the first country to enter outer space. Huge things were achieved with a socialist planned economy. Now, that doesn't mean everything was perfect. Obviously, there were a lot of things that were wrong and eventually played a role in leading to the Soviet Union's collapse. But if you look at China, China had no steel mills at the time of the revolution in 1949. Today, half of the steel in the world is produced in China's government-controlled steel industry, part of their socialist planned economy. If you look at, the world tourism industry is having a boom right now. because, Chinese people whose parents and grandparents were illiterate peasants, people that were malnourished and lived in huts are now going on vacation to Paris and New York City and Australia. You really can't say that socialist economics has been a failure. You want to see a failure, go to countries in the third world where they've let these free market neoliberal institutions operate. Look what the World Bank has done for the people of Bangladesh. Look what the free market is doing for people in Colombia, right? There's poverty all over the world. We hear about people fleeing Cuba and trying to get to the United States. Well, every day people are fleeing Mexico, a free market economy that fully cooperates, privatizations. They privatize their oil. They've privatized everything. The drug cartels are running rampant. People are hungry. People are homeless. That's capitalism that people are fleeing from in Mexico. So there's a lot of confusion, and the way that we hear it is very loaded. I think people are often stuck in kind of a Cold War narrative. They don't quite understand the reality, but the socialist planned economies have had tremendous results across the world. And I've visited different countries around the world, and I've seen the results of centrally planned economies. And the reality is that there have been great achievements that have gone on. I went to Ecuador in 1999 when I was a small child. They had just switched to the US dollar as their currency. This was the height of free market policies. Privatizations were going on. And I got off the airplane. I saw crowds of just starving people. Well, I went back to Ecuador in 2013 for the World Democratic Youth Festival, and it was like a totally different country. What Correa and the Bolivarian government had done in Ecuador had just rapidly transformed the country. They have public control of oil, public control of major heights. Correa, now his successor, Lenin Moreno, who was just elected, they are moving the country towards socialism very rapidly and raising people out of poverty. I mean, it was just kind of amazing to see what had gone on when, public control, they'd seized control of their own economy and begun working in the interests of their own country, not the interest of these Wall Street global monopolists. And for a long time, this kind of global setup of capitalism, you could say that it benefited average Americans, right? The global monopolists, they were bombing Korea and bombing Vietnam, and we average Americans, our lifestyle and our standard of living was increasing. But now we can see that what they've done to so many third world countries, they're now doing to places like Pennsylvania and Ohio and Wisconsin and Michigan and so many parts of the United States. We've seen that these global monopolists have destroyed the standard of living. The jobs have been eliminated, and we're seeing really the rise of what I like to call a low-wage police state in the United States, where our wages are going down. The next generation is living in living conditions nothing like what their parents had. But at the same time, we're seeing a huge level of police state repression, people kicking down doors, police officers killing people and not getting away with it, the NSA listening to our phones. We're seeing capitalism in decay in the United States, this free market system where we let capitalists make money off of everything. I mean, how rational is it to have prisons for profit, right? When a private company is getting paid for everyone who gets locked up, when they're contracted by the government and they're getting paid for every person who gets locked up, what is their motivation? They want as many people in that prison as possible, right? This is not rational. This is not sane. And this is what we're dealing with. We're dealing with kind of an out of control capitalism in the United States at this time.
Well, I've heard people's fear about socialistic countries, which some people refer to as communist countries, saying, well, you don't have free thought there. The government can put you in jail forever and torture you and blah, blah, blah. What do you have to say to that? Is this hokey stuff that people are just getting from mainstream media, or just what is your take on that?
Well, I think there's a couple ways to come at that question. Now, the first point that needs to be made is that the circumstances that these countries have been in, right? After the Russian Revolution, almost every Western country invaded them. There was a blockade. They were facing an onslaught. Millions of people were dying. And under those kinds of circumstances, you can't have some kind of, human rights paradise where everyone has freedom. You look at the North Koreans, 4 million people died during the Korean War. And then during the 1990s, when they lost their oil supply and their food production system came to a grinding halt, a million people died. They're facing some really desperate, dire conditions. And under those kind of circumstances, to expect countries to just have, total freedom and let everyone say whatever they want, that's kind of absurd. A lot of times these socialist countries are locked down and trying to build themselves up, and they're facing just an onslaught. I mean, the Soviet Union, you had 26 million people died when the Nazis invaded. 26 million. I mean, can you imagine that? I mean, that's huge, right? And under those kind of circumstances, you can see that societies can become very authoritarian. But However, I also want to say that, that not all of these countries have the same kind of history and tradition that we have. And if we were ever going to have socialism in the United States, it wouldn't be a Russian socialism. It wouldn't be a Chinese socialism. It wouldn't be a Korean or Cuban socialism. We would have an American form of socialism. It would be a socialism rooted in our traditions and our progressive struggles, It would be a socialism that would be a continuation of the progressive struggles that have gone on in this country, the struggle to abolish slavery, the labor movement. And one thing that's deeply important to the American people is their freedom and their Bill of Rights. And I think that the freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, freedom to protest would absolutely preserve. We would just get some other freedoms. We get the freedom to be guaranteed a job. We get the freedom to be able to see a doctor when we're sick and have that guaranteed. We'd have the freedom. We wouldn't even have a welfare state, right? This is the idea. We hear that socialism is welfare. Well, no, welfare exists because we don't have socialism. In a socialist economy, everyone is unleashed. I think the millennial generation, this is one of the most skilled generations in history. They know how to do computers. They are educated. They have degrees. But so many of them are unemployed. So many young people, so full of potential, are stuck. Either they're unemployed or they're, sweeping floors in McDonald's. And I think, one of the things that a socialist government would immediately do is employ them all, unleash them, and have them start building. Right now, our infrastructure is in decay. It's about time we had some high-speed trains. It's about time that our roads and our bridges started getting rebuilt. And during the Great Depression, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a president who did align himself with socialists and communists. He was not a socialist or a communist, but he was aligned with the Communist Party. That was one of the things he did, is he immediately started employing the young people to go out and start building and constructing. The LaGuardia Airport here in New York City was constructed by young people who were hired by Roosevelt's program. The Key West Highway in Florida. So many of the post offices. So much was done when the government said, look, we're in a crisis, and now it's time to start doing what the private sector won't do. Now it's time to start stimulating and building. As the market collapses, it's time for the state to intervene on behalf of the population.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Really, after all of the talk and looking at history, it concerned me moving forward with whatever economic status that we do, that we don't have some sort of ruling class over the people, whether, during the Roman Empire, it was the Roman government or empire, whatever, and some government or empire. Do you ever see a time in which really the people will be ruling over themselves and their own, world?
It's very interesting because, I go around the country as a journalist. I interview people, and when you talk to people on the far left and you talk to people on the far right, they all have kind of a similar narrative. They all agree, somebody else has the power. We, the people, don't run the United States, and the economy and the government are working for somebody else other than us. And you ask people, well, who is them? Who is the other, right? And you'll get a lot of interesting explanations. People say the Freemasons or the Illuminati or the thing that's high up on the thing or the Trilateral Commission. You get a lot of different answers, right? And the funny thing is, I think that the socialist or the Marxist narrative is actually probably the most rational of that. We don't need a story. There's no one sacrificing any goats. There's no magic. We're just saying that the people that have the power are those who own the economy, the billionaires, the monopolists, the people who own the big oil companies and the big banks and the cartels, these billionaire elites. That they're the ones who run the economy. And the reason that it's functioning the way it is they're trying to make profits for themselves. I mean, there's no conspiracy theory here. There's no need for any black helicopters or anything like that. And that's the narrative. And that empowering ordinary people is part of, the socialist idea, is that people ought to have a say in their workplace. People ought to have a say in an average everyday life. People ought to have more of a say. And doing that means putting economic institutions into their own hands. I've been to Venezuela, and Venezuela is not doing very well right now. I know that, the oil revenue has been cut off, but part of the reason the government there stays in power, even though they're facing this crisis, this onslaught, the oil prices have dropped, and, their food is being not allowed. I know that they've reported that people in the United States who want to send food to Venezuela at this point are being told by the Office of Foreign Assets Control they can't send food in. So we're blaming them for having a food crisis, saying this is the result of socialism, but then we're stopping people from sending food. That doesn't quite correspond. But one of the reasons that I think that the Bolivarian government has held on to power for so long is because they have empowered people on a community level. You go to any neighborhood in Venezuela, they have what's called Bolivarian circles, where the people in the neighborhood, they come together and they say, okay, what are we doing on a local level? There's somebody in every apartment building who knows everybody and is in touch with them and is talking to them about what the government's vision is or something like that. And, what is a Soviet? We hear about the Soviet Union. We think it's just some Russian word. Well, Soviet means council. And that was how the Bolsheviks ultimately came to power, is during the uprisings that were going on against the Tsar. They built these community councils. And eventually, the slogan was all power to the Soviets, and the Soviet Union was created. I mean, that was the name of the Soviet Union. You go to China, they have similar things. You can go, socialist governments tend to draw their support from a community level, from a very well-organized population. That's kind of how they draw their support. I've been to many different countries and I've seen it.
Mm-hmm. Is it possible, you think, that in the world, in the United States and in the world, where we can have more community-based, local level, less big government or empires or, governments of any sort running the people? And do you think, for me, I'm wondering if it's perhaps also that people don't want to step and they'd rather let someone else take care of the responsibility of running things. Is that part of it as well, you think?
Well, I think that if you look at the way the media operates, and if you look at the way our education system operates, everything is really encouraging people not to engage about politics, not to engage about what goes on in the government, not to think about it, focus on celebrity gossip, focus on sports, focus on anything but what's actually happening. People are really actively depoliticized under our system. There's this feeling that we should just leave it up to the people in Washington, D.C., and for a lot of U.S. history, it was the case. I mean, after the Second World War, we had a very booming economy, and people had comfortable jobs in, steel and auto manufacturing, and we had such a booming economy. A lot of people said, well, I'm not too worried about politics. But as much as, the ruling elite would like to depoliticize people, we're facing a crisis. And especially among the younger generation, lots of young people are getting involved because they're saying, look, the way things are going is not okay. I'm not okay with the way things are. I want to get involved. I want to do something about it. And we see, and it's not just far left. We see far right, and we see libertarian, all kinds of circles. A lot of young people are unhappy with the future of their country. And at the same time that there has been, these problems that have developed in the economy and the police state, there has been a huge growth in the accessibility of information. So now we can Google things, we can look things up, and the ability, to process information and to gain knowledge about things has really increased. And you'll look at, let's go back, right? I talk about, human history advancing, right? Well, the overthrow of feudalism and the establishment of capitalism was one thing that was decisive in that was the printing press. When Johannes Gutenberg started employing the printing press, which was cutting-edge technology at that time, I know it had actually been invented by the Koreans much earlier, but he started using it in Germany. And when Johannes Gutenberg started using the printing press, and all of a sudden people in Europe had the ability to print out information, and you had a press, and you had newspapers, and you had people reading the Bible for themselves and deciding what they thought it said, and not just depending on Rome to do it. That was a breakthrough, and that ultimately laid the basis for a huge social explosion. And the computer revolution and the revolution in information is also a big aspect of what's going on. I mean, computers came into existence mainly. I mean, you look at Alan Turing, and it was a way to defeat the Nazis during the Second World War. That was the breakthroughs, but ultimately, computers have been utilized by capitalism. I mean, the Pentagon, Al Gore said he invented the internet. Well, it wasn't Al Gore that invented it. It was actually the Pentagon. It was the military. It was done for military purposes. But pretty soon, the inventions of the old system lay the basis for the new system to come into being. And I think that this computer revolution and the widespread use of information done mainly by capitalists in order to facilitate capitalism could lay the basis for a new system coming into existence. And we're living in very, very exciting times. The drive of a capitalist is they want to produce as much as they possibly can, right, for as little as they possibly can pay. But at the same time, workers are also consumers. So if you advance productivity and you make it so, you have now with Amazon Create a Page, one person pushes a button and a book comes out, right? You don't have book binderies with thousands of people. Yes. If you create an economy where you don't need workers, or workers are just being eliminated in industry, pretty soon people's spending power goes down and people can't spend like they once did before. And this is the problem of capitalism, that eventually the drive to make profits, the drive to lower wages, creates a situation where there's a glut in the market with products that can't be sold. And that's the overwhelming problem of capitalism. We produce not for use. We don't produce cars because people need a place to drive. We produce cars to make profits. We don't build houses because people need shelter. We build houses so landlords and bankers and others can make money off of them. And if you look at, we had a very unique situation during the 2008 financial crisis in the United States, where, we had, there had been the housing bubble burst. All of a sudden, all these easy loans people were getting to buy houses weren't materializing. And all of a sudden, we had people all across the country losing their jobs, losing their homes, becoming homeless because there's too many houses. Right? That's the irrationality of capitalism. In times past, in feudalism, people were hungry because there wasn't enough food being produced. There was a famine, wasn't enough food, people were hungry. Now, because of capitalism, we live in a system where people are hungry because there is too much food. We live in a system where people are homeless because there are too many houses. We live in a system where people are cold in the wintertime because there's too much heating gas. The irrationality of a system based on profits is becoming very, very apparent if you look at the way the global economy functions at this time.
Yeah. And honestly, we had recent past shows, not recent shows, but past shows where we kind of touched on how, we all kind of played a part in it. I know I've said on the show before that there was a time where I was overspending on credit and things are going well, you're making good money, and you don't realize that credit is actually not free money, but you're paying hugely for it. For fun today, for tomorrow, you're going to pay back hugely. And I think it's been a mindset that's been put into the American public. Well, I need 10 of these in every color because I just want it. And then at what cost? Because we had a girl come on and talk about sustainability. Well, if you want to make the environment better, we have to think about how we live our lives in the world. If you go out and get a shirt for $1, it certainly wasn't made in the United States because we don't, sit behind a sewer for $1. So yeah, it's kind of will take us all, if we want to change systems, really thinking about how we're living in our lives and what does it reflect our greater inner values.
Yeah, well, if you look at when you talk about the national debt and you look at the way the economy is organized right now, I think a great example is oil, right? Oil and natural gas. The USA is now the top natural gas producing country in the world, with a third top producing oil country in the world. And every day we sell oil. They've actually lifted. In 1974, we had an oil export ban that we could only sell oil to China. That's been lifted. So now we're selling oil all over the world. But at the same time that we're selling oil to China, we're selling oil to many different countries, we're also importing oil from Saudi Arabia and from Nigeria. What sense does this make, right? Now, if we had a socialist economy, right, what we would do is we would use the oil that we have here for domestic purposes, and then the oil that was left over, we would sell on the international markets to different countries, and then the revenue would go into the state treasury, right? And that would be what we would do. We have this huge natural resource deposit. We would use it for the public good. But right now we have an economy where the oil companies, whether it's the small fracking companies or the big giants like ExxonMobil and BP Shell, are all just trying to make profits, and it's irrational and crazy.
Yeah.
And that's kind of an understanding. Before the financial crisis, Alan Greenspan legalized all kinds of credit that had been illegal before. And people blame him. They say, well, he just shouldn't have done that. But they're kind of missing what was his motivation for doing that. It was to keep people spending, because Americans at this point just don't have the income that they once had. If you look at the income of the average American in the 50s and the 60s, even the 70s and 80s, it's just not there anymore. People couldn't spend. And so Alan Greenspan was sitting there at the Federal Reserve, desperately trying to keep Americans spending money. He legalized all kinds of credit card schemes, all kinds of housing schemes, anything to keep people spending money so that the crash wouldn't come, because the crash was really rooted in the problem of capitalism, which is that if you cut people's wages, if you make production more and more efficient, people ultimately won't have the spending power, and pretty soon you have a glut. Even now, you look at the new normal that we had after the financial crisis, right? In 2008, 2009, there was this new normal. Okay, we're not going to have the industrial jobs anymore, but we're going to have retail jobs, right? Well, those retail jobs are being eliminated now. Walmarts are shutting down across the country. People are using Amazon Prime, right? People don't need those retail jobs, right? People said, okay, well, maybe the suburbs are dying and the housing prices there are down, but there's these urban areas, right? Well, look at what's been happening lately. The housing prices in these new urban centers are starting to drop, right? That it's a crisis. We are facing a systemic crisis. Capitalism is at the point that it's just not functioning, and we're facing a systemic crisis of capitalism.
Yeah. And it would have seemed to me from what we're talking about today that one of the best things we can do as a general public here in the United States is really start to educate ourselves. As you said, information is so vital. It's out there. It's accessible right now. So anyone, it doesn't matter who you are, can get the information. Learn for yourself. Don't take what mainstream media tells you. And on the other hand, what happened for me 2 years ago after creating a bunch of debt and also having a company that went under that I tried to start and going bankrupt, I cut up my credit cards, and I now do not spend on credit, which is really, really hard going on that diet because you're so used to being able to pull out that plastic. And I love C.K. Lewis, the comedian, said, hey, remember the good old days when your paycheck was over and fun, was no more until next paycheck? Well, we have to go back to not getting things instant gratification, getting whatever you see because it looks nice, and then not really having it doesn't have any value for you. I think if we all start to put into that, we can start to change the direction of this country and the world.
Absolutely. I think we're at a point where capitalism is really encouraging the most kind of irrational and primitive instincts on the part of people. You look at TV with the violence, with the sex, with the lack of any coherent plot structure, and a lot of these television programs. So many TV programs are just following a rich person around. Oh, look at me! I just bought a pair of shoes that cost $500. Oh, look at me! I just peed in a golden toilet. Right? That seems to be so much of the programming that we're getting is very, very crass.
Yeah.
People tell you that capitalism creates innovation. I say to them, then tell me, why does Hollywood make the same movie over and over and over and over again, right? Capitalists do like innovation on some level, but they prefer not to. They want to secure investment. They want to hedge their bets and make sure that they'll make the money. And if you look at it, that we're seeing a kind of an interesting situation in the globe today, where in a lot of ways, we have access to information, but people are not as smart as they used to be. People aren't challenging themselves. People aren't educating themselves. Culture is really in decay, and education is really in decay. People are kind of hiding from the reality. And I've been to Iran, I've been to Venezuela, I've been to Ecuador, and a lot of times people say to me, oh, the young people, the children in those countries are brainwashed. They're brainwashed. Well, I'll say to them, well, if you ask an average American teenager or someone in their 20s, can you find Iraq, Iran, Venezuela on a map? Most of them will say no. But you go to any of those countries and you show people a map, they can find the United States, they can find their country. People seem to be much more tuned in to politics. We're taught that we're free, but it's almost like, people say, I think for myself, right? I think for myself. In a lot of ways, it's almost think for yourself has become an excuse for not thinking at all.
Exactly. It's interesting because they done polls on the street where they just asked someone, so who is our first president? They can't answer that. I'm like, oh my gosh, you're in the United States. You don't know who's the first. So yeah, it's a little scary. But really, and that's what reason why we started this segment, really to hopefully get people out there just to start becoming curious is the first start. Not just turning on TV. Okay, I was fed today. It told me what to think. Go out there and start researching and looking out for yourself and saying, is what I heard on CNN, ABC, Fox, or whatever true? And could it maybe not be true? Let me just see. And you're one person out there working to get the truth out. And where can people find out more about you?
Oh, well, I'm always online. I'm always doing different reports. You can visit my website, calebmaupin.info, CALEBMAUPIN.info. That's where most of my work is posted. And I'm always just out there trying to ask tough questions and engage with the truth and get to the truth.
Absolutely. And you're on YouTube as well?
I am. I'm on YouTube. I'm on Facebook. I'm on Twitter. I'm on social media. So I'm out there trying to just put my 2 cents in, ask tough questions, and point out things that the mainstream media likes to ignore.
Yes, it's very important that we all do that. And I thank you for being one out there to look and search for the truth, bring it to the people. I thank you so much for coming to Savvy Business Radio today to share. Thank you so much.
It's absolutely been a pleasure. Absolutely.
After 5 years of creating exciting business content with amazing businesses from around the world, Savvy is now creating a new video series entitled Heartbeat of the World. This series will feature experts from around the globe. We will highlight and discuss some of the greatest challenges facing the U.S. and the world. Co-create with us and find out more at bit.ly/SavvyPatron.
Savvy Business Radio and runs in syndication on 8 AM/FM stations nationwide, including iHeartRadio and 6 podcasting platforms. To find out about our paid sponsorship opportunities or to become a guest and find out how we can help you get your message out in a bigger way, call 732-474-7375 or email Christina at savvybusinessradio.com.